So thank you all for joining the Iowa State University Textiles and Clothing Museum Fashion and Justice speaker series. So my name is Dr. Kelly Reddy-Best, and I'm an associate professor in apparel merchandising and design at Iowa State, and also the director and curator of the Textiles and Clothing Museum. So in this lecture series, we host fashion studies scholars and museum professionals who consider a social justice lens in their scholarship on dress and fashion. And if you could advance the slide now, please, Liz. Thanks. Thanks, Liz. So today I am so pleased to introduce Elizabeth Lowe. She is an associate curator of costume at the museum at the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York City. Her exhibitions include Black fashion designers in 2016 and Fabric and Fashion in 2018 and Head to Toe, which is opening in 2021. So Way's personal research focuses on the intersection of African American culture and fashion. She edited and authored chapters in Black Designers in American Fashion, which is published with Bloomsbury in 2021, and I highly, highly recommend it. It's pictured on the left there. Other recent publications include Dressing to Pass During the Harlem Renaissance, Fashion in the Novels of Jessie Redmon, Fauset and Nella Larsen in Fashion Theory in 2020, and Strands of the Diaspora, Black Hair in the Americas 1800 to 1920 in A Cultural History of Hair in the Age of Empire, 1800 to 1920, which was published in 2018. She holds an MA in Costume Studies from New York University and a BS in Apparel Design and a BA in History, very impressive, from the University of Delaware. And in this lecture, Liz will discuss her personal approach as a curator and researcher to bringing diverse perspectives to fashion objects and narratives. So I am so thankful that you're here today, Liz, and being our guest, and I'll now hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Kelly. And I'm so happy. Thank you for having me. And I'm so happy to be able to speak with you guys today. I'm going to go through, as Kelly said, a little bit of my own work and my own kind of perspectives in curating and a little bit of in researching and writing. And then hopefully there'll be lots of questions and we can have a great discussion afterwards. So here's the beginning of my lecture, and I'm talking a little bit today about race and gender identities in how I both curate, research, and write around fashion history. So this is my first kind of object here. I'm not, never actually been able to put this object in an exhibition. As you can see, this is with the Smithsonian, but this is an object that I've thought a lot about and written about a little bit as well. And so I want to start with this object because an object like this really helps me kind of think about my own perspective and my the way I'm going to intervene into fashion history. So this is, if we look at the label, it's a purple velvet dress. This is just the bodice, of course, for Mary Lincoln. And in this exhibition, this tombstone label, you get a lot of information, right? You get the materials, you get the fact that it's a dress bodice, you get that it was worn by Mary Lincoln. And that is most likely the reason why this piece was collected by the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. This was worn by a First Lady. This is part of their First Lady's collection. And I believe the last time I was there was on display. It might not be on display anymore. But when we think about fashion objects, especially ones like this, we collect them because they venerate, they tell a story about a certain person. And in this case, it was the wife of Abraham Lincoln, who was no doubt a very, very important president. And we can see this is an image of Mary Todd Lincoln, and there's a lot of things to think about when we think about her and fashion. She was often very much criticized for the way she dressed, and so we can really think about gendered perspectives here. You can see here she has these flowers in her hair. This was something that she was very specifically criticized on, also wearing these off-the-shoulder gowns that you see pictured here. This was considered fashion that was maybe more appropriate for a younger woman than Mary Todd Lincoln was at this point. And so she definitely was known for enjoying fashion, for buying fashion, perhaps spending a little bit too much on fashion, especially French fashion, which is conversations that happen around other first ladies. But there's certainly a lot to dig into when we think about this woman and her fashion objects. But my own personal research looks at this object in a very different way. So here you can see that the tombstone information is slightly different. Here we have Elizabeth Cackley's name added, and she is the dressmaker who made this, this bodice and the entire ensemble. She's an African-American woman. She was formerly enslaved. And she really has an extraordinary story, not only as an influencer and maker of American fashion, as we can see through this dress, which was, talked about at the time when it was worn. It was obviously preserved for posterity and comes down to us today and seen by, thousands upon thousands of people at the Smithsonian every year. So this is a woman who had a profound influence on American fashion, but she's also a woman who was formerly enslaved, who wrote a memoir. She was an abolitionist. She was a teacher. She was an employer of other Black women. So this is an object that we can look at in a museum collection and think about different ways that we can tell stories about American history, about fashion. So this is an image here of Elizabeth Cackley. So Cackley was born in 1818 in Virginia, Dinwiddie County, Virginia, very rural plantation. Her mother, Agnes, was also a dressmaker, very skilled, and her father was the plantation owner, Armistead Burrell. But Elizabeth learned fashion making from her mother from a very, very young age. In her memoir, she discusses, helping to repair socks at 6. By the time she was a teenager, she moves to North Carolina with one of her half brothers. Who is she's kind of transferred to his ownership, and she's a very skilled dressmaker. She moves again to St. Louis, and this is where she really kind of starts to establish a business. And it's also a really great story to think about different narratives within enslaved people's lives. I think there tends to be kind of singular narratives around enslaved people, especially when we think about the mid-19th century. This was a woman who was certainly enslaved, but she ran a business. She supported her owner's family. She was in St. Louis, that was, a slave state, in a slave state, and separated by a free state by a river. This is a river that she traversed daily in the course of her business. So she could have, made a bid for freedom. She certainly interacted with free Black people. And so this is a really interesting story in how we can think about enslaved people's lives, but also how we think about how fashion was made and who made fashion. I think it's hopefully safe to assume that the clothes that she's pictured in were made or designed by her, made by people in her shop. So we can get a sense of her fashion and the way she kind of positions herself in portraits like this. Another dressmaker that I have studied a lot is Anne Lowe. I'm actually working on an exhibition with the Winterthur Museum in Wilmington for an exhibition on Lowe's work that'll open in fall 2023. But Anne Lowe was another designer who was we might say anonymous, even though she made dresses that really impacted American fashion. So we can see here, this is another First Lady. This is Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy on her wedding day. And Anne Lowe made, this might be on a timer, so hopefully that's not the case. Anne Lowe made this dress as well. So again, this is a dress that was photographed a lot, that was in national magazines and international magazines. No doubt brides, that year and years subsequently looked at this dress for inspiration for their own wedding dresses. So Anne Lowe made pieces that had a huge effect on American and international fashion. Yet very few people know who she is, knew that she made this dress. She specialized in dresses for upper class white women, especially wedding dresses and debutante gowns. But she was from Alabama. Montgomery is where she kind of spent her childhood, and her mother and grandmother were both formerly enslaved and both very skilled dressmakers. So we see a lot of parallels between her life and Elizabeth Cackley's life. But she moved to Tampa, Florida, where she had a thriving business, and then to New York in 1928, where she had several kind of iterations of her business. This portrait here is from Ebony magazine, and you can see this dress in the background. This dress, I'm not sure if it's the exact same dress or just the same style, is actually owned by the Metropolitan Museum of Art, so it's in their collection. But again, we can look at this picture of Jacqueline Kennedy in this wedding dress, and of course we can think a lot about her influence in fashion, her relationship with fashion. This is obviously very different from the kind of 1960s more minimalist style that she's known for. So we can think about the evolution of her style, but we can also think about a whole other history of African American designers, the way they passed down skills from mother to daughter, the way they moved within the United States in the Jim Crow South and participated in the Great Migration, moving to New York. So there's a lot of stories to be told here. And I think that if we dig deep enough, we can start to see things in a lot of collections that have alternative stories to tell, not just around African American history, but a myriad of other kind of marginalized histories. So I want to talk about, so both of those dressmakers are dressmakers that I looked at in my master's thesis when I was studying at NYU, but I've also continued to look at through my research afterwards. But I want to talk a little bit about the work that I've done at the museum at FIT. So I started as a curatorial assistant in 2013. It's a long time ago now. But one of the first writing projects that I worked on was for this exhibition, Dance and Fashion. This is curated by our director, Dr. Valerie Steele, and she was looking a lot at kind of the confluence of influences between fashion and dance. A large part of it was fashion designers who designed ballet costumes, like this one on the cover of the book. This is by Arris Van Hurban, who's of course very well known for these 3D printed dresses. But she asked me to write a chapter in the book on African-American culture and fashion and dance. And so she asked me this because, I published a little bit on my master's work. I was establishing myself as this kind of area of my interest. And I didn't know anything about dance, so it was a learning curve on that end. But I was able to, draw a lot of parallels from what I had learned about Cackley and Lowe and more general reading, and kind of see how dance fit into this picture. So these are two examples that I talk about in the chapter that I wrote. One is the cakewalk. You can see there's this very cool video. It's very short. You probably find it online from the Library of Congress, but it's actually a film of these people doing the cakewalk. And then, of course, there's Carmen de Lavalette and Jeffrey Holder in a performance they were doing. And you can see how fashion plays a big role in both of these kind of dances. One is concert dance with the Lavalette and Holder, and the other one is more vernacular dance with cakewalk. I believe this film is probably a performance, but based on a more vernacular dance. And then looking into the research and the writing, I was also drew me to objects that found their way into the exhibition. So you can see this white dress. This was worn by Judith Jamison, a phenomenal dancer who danced with Alvin Ailey. In the back in yellow with the hat is another piece from an Alvin Ailey choreography called Revelations, which is probably his most famous. And then here on the right is Katherine Dunham. This is an ensemble that Katherine Dunham wore. So she was a modern dance dancer and choreographer, but also an anthropologist who went down to especially the Caribbean and documented a lot of West African dance traditions and wrote about them and kind of recreated them in performances in New York and Chicago. I mean, all over the country, but I believe she was mostly based there. So another exhibition that I want to speak about is Global Fashion Capitals. So I co-curated this with my colleague at the time. Her name is Ariel Alaya. And this was actually a subject that she had come up with another curator. And in the shuffle of kind of things that happened at the museum, she and I ended up co-curating it together. And what this was really ended up being a snapshot kind of global fashion in 2015, 2016. You can see installation shot here, and this exhibition looked at several fashion cities. So this is in our history gallery at the museum at FIT. If you've ever been to FIT, you kind of recognize this space because these platforms are permanent, and we usually kind of create a chronology of fashion in this space. So kind of sticking with a slightly chronological theme, we looked at the big four fashion capitals, starting with Paris, and then New York, London, and Milan. What you see pictured here on this kind of stretch in the back is Tokyo and Antwerp, which we kind of thought of as these liminal fashion spaces, certainly not emerging onto the fashion scene, definitely well established, but really more since the 1980s, 90s, etc. And then after that, we looked at a handful of other cities that at that time were really influencing fashion. So in the very back corner, you can see Stockholm and also Berlin. And then on the right here in this black piece is Sydney, Australia, this piece by Dion Lee. But we also looked at Shanghai, we looked at Seoul, we looked at Lagos. And what really was important for us in this exhibition, I think, was to look beyond, Paris and London as fashion capitals and really recognize that fashion, especially high fashion in a Western kind of tradition, does take place in other places, that different cultures, different localities have a lot to offer, kind of what we might consider the big four in terms of fashion design, and also what it means to put pieces in a museum gallery. We have this dress by Big Park. Big Park is a Korean label that is run by a very well-established fashion designer who's been working since the 1950s, and he works with his daughters who are kind of younger, the next generation. And you can see there's a very kind of pop influence on the graphics here. But what does it mean when we take that dress and hang it in the same gallery as a Christian Dior, as a Charles James, as a piece by Balenciaga? And we really wanted to kind of create these dialogues and have people think about what is considered good design, what is considered, who's considered an important fashion designer. And this was a way that we could also really diversify our collection. I believe that a lot of collections are looking to diversify their holdings, but kind of in the reality of things, exhibitions are probably one of the biggest ways that we expand our collections, because that's when we have the time to research and kind of discover new things and bring them into the collection. So this was a great opportunity to do that. So Arielle and I also co-curated Black fashion designers, and this again was it was her idea. We both separately saw an exhibition that the Pratt Manhattan Galleries had put on, I believe in 2014 or 2015, called Black Dress, and it was 10 contemporary Black designers. This was curated by Adrienne Jones. But as part of this exhibition, which as you can imagine was quite small, there was this large wall graphic that was like a scroll, and she listed as many names of Black designers as she knew of. And so there's maybe like 200 names or so on this list. And Arielle took a picture of this, and she went back to our collection, and she started researching how many of these designs do we have in our collection. We had a fair amount, especially, we think about Stephen Burrows, Patrick Kelly. We had a fair amount of designers because most of our objects come from donations. So if they were a popular designer, especially like the 70s, 80s, 90s, and women have gotten to the point where they're kind of divesting their wardrobes, these things end up in our collection. But there were a lot of blind spots, and this was another opportunity for us to really collect things and diversify our collection. One thing I didn't mention was that in our history gallery, everything in these shows are part of our permanent collection. It's a way for us to showcase our permanent collection, so we don't deal with loans in this space. So again, it makes it a really great space to look at our own collection. When we thought about curating this exhibition, we knew that it would be, it wasn't controversial, but there was certainly going to be a lot of criticism of it to make sure that we did it right. And so this involved Arielle and I having a lot of conversations, a lot of debates, because, and one thing I think we did do a good job of is we were prepared. We were prepared for the questions we were going to get in the press because we'd already asked ourselves these questions and talked about our answers. But one of the things that was important to us is that we did not want to convey any type of idea that there was one kind of aesthetic style that Black designers worked in. Black designers work all over the industry. They have their own personal styles, but we were able to kind of categorize them thematically within this exhibition, both within history and then according to the types of designs that they made. For example, this is our opening gallery, and you can see a sample of some of the kind of themes that we have. For example, we have an Ann Lowe dress here on the very left. This is a dress from a wedding dress from 1968, and we paired it with this more contemporary piece by Amsal, a wedding dress designer. We have a piece by Jeffrey Holder here in fuchsia in the middle. And then we had different categories. For example, we focus on menswear in one, menswear and tailoring in one section. You can see this Oswald Boateng suit here. But some of the categories some of the themes that we looked at were breaking into the industry, looking at early designers from the 1950s, 60s, 70s, who were really kind of making a mark in the New York fashion industry. Being at FIT right here on 7th Avenue, which you might be able to see behind me here, we have a natural kind of focus on New York, even though this exhibition did look at some international designers. And typically in our history gallery, and I'll show you some images from later shows that I did, we can create a chronology from the 18th century to the present. But when it came to Black designers, we really discovered that the 1950s were about as early as we could go in our collections and in the things that we could acquire. So that was a much, much shorter chronology. That being said, I do believe this was kind of like the largest chronology covered by a fashion exhibition on Black designers, at least up until that date. So other themes that we have looked at evening wear, looked at the influence of street style and activism. So this is my activism section, and Arielle and I kind of divided sections up between us in our curatorial kind of process, and this is one that I worked on. And I really liked this this is probably my favorite section of the show because these pieces are so poignant. So we have here on the left is a dress base and overalls designed by Patrick Kelly. So Patrick Kelly did most of his work in Paris, and you can see a T-shirt that he also created on the top left that really venerates Paris, as well as Josephine Baker, so another Black American who moved to Paris. But he really drew a lot from his upbringing in Mississippi to inspire his designs. And if you know anything about his designs, he took a lot of kind of racial imagery and kind of turned it on its head. And in the very right on the bottom, you can see this case with these tiny little black baby dolls. And these were actual kind of gifts, favors that he gave out at his fashion shows. But this overalls dress speaks to the history of sharecropping and kind of uneven labor practices and kind of rural poverty that surrounded his upbringing. And then in the middle, we have this piece by a South African label called Stone Cherry. And on the T-shirt, you can see a recreation of this magazine cover called Drum. And so Drum was produced in Sophiatown in South Africa under apartheid in Johannesburg. And so Sophiatown was a neighborhood in a township in Johannesburg. And this was a really important publication at this time. It was kind of the equivalent of what we might think of as Life or Ebony. It was pictorial driven, but really a huge outlet of creativity and celebration of Black life in apartheid South Africa, where that was very rare. And then on the right, we have Pierre Moss. So Pierre Moss, I'm sure you are kind of familiar with his most recent show, his couture show, but his label is so great for museum exhibitions because there's always such an in-depth story and so much historical research that goes into it. So this was a collection he did based on the story of Otenga Bunga, who was a Congolese man who was kidnapped from the Congo and put on display in the Bronx Zoo in the Monkey House in, I believe, in 1916. So you can see a very kind of poignant story in what he was creating. But also during this collection, he wore the T-shirt that you see on the upper left. And so this contained the name of 13 men, Black men, who were killed by the police. And so this was a huge part of his protest fashion as well. But we also wanted to show that, they're different. Black designers aren't always kind of talking about race. On the bottom left, we have this shirt made by Willie Bear that raised awareness for AIDS. And then on the bottom right, this is a company that's owned by Pharrell, the musician. This is made from plastic bottles pulled from the ocean, and it has a very kind of environmental message as well. So when I kind of do my own personal research, and often, as you've seen in kind of the exhibitions I do, I focus a lot on the intersection of African-American culture and fashion. But this was a show that I was really excited to work on with the deputy director called Expedition. And Expedition looked at how extreme weather gear like spacesuits, which is what I worked on, like Arctic gear, like scuba diving gear, influenced fashion. And so I did this really deep dive into spacesuits. I didn't know anything about spacesuits. They were made by ILC, which you can see here, which is the International Latex Corporation. It's based in Delaware. So this is the same company that makes Playtex bras. So the women who were sewing these spacesuits actually came off the line, the factory line, who they made bras, they made girdles, they did the latex dipping to kind of create the stretch for these garments, and they were able to apply those skills to spacesuits. But ways that I kind of interject ideas about like gender and race, or even in very subtle little ways. For example, in this picture, I really wanted to, there were several pictures that were available of women sewing spacesuits, but I really wanted to include this one of Hazel Fellows because she's a Black woman. I really wanted to like push her into this space that wasn't about race, but to let people know that, Black women were there too. Also, women were there. I think conversations around space exploration, especially in the 60s, leave out the story of women. And of course, this is before Hidden Figures had come. Maybe it was like right around the time Hidden Figures had come out. So a very different story, but very kind of much in the same vein. So the next show I want to talk about is fabric and fashion. So this was the first show that I curated on my own, and this was again in the History Gallery. And you can see even from this image that we did include 18th century pieces in this show. But I did my training as an apparel design. In apparel design, I wanted to be a fashion designer in undergrad. I think by my senior year, I kind of realized I wasn't going to be a fashion designer, but I've always very interested in fabric and sewing. And I wanted to see how we could kind of bring this into the gallery. So one of the things that was important about this show is that in a lot of previous shows that I worked on, we had to do a lot of primary research. Sorry, my printer is going off and I'm not quite sure why. It's networked and sometimes I get print jobs from all over the university. For global fashion capitals, for Black fashion designers, we had to go straight to the newspapers and the original sources. In some cases, we interviewed people because there wasn't a lot of secondary information out there. For fabric and fashion, this was all secondary information. People have written a lot about the history of textiles, and so I just wanted to bring it to life in a way that utilized our collection and MFIT. We are located at a university, just like in Iowa. So we do cater to students. We always want to make sure there's something for the students, especially in our history gallery. So I opened the show with this piece. And this was, I worked very closely with our digital media manager at FIT. Her name is Tamsin, and she really worked this out for me because I wanted to make a projection. And what you see here is a toile. It's a muslin copy of an 18th century dress that we use in our study collection. And it's being over projected with images from textiles in our collection. So here you can see a kente cloth that we hold, that we photographed and turned into an image that we could project it. So I thought this would be very straightforward because it's like, the white and everything that was projected on the black would just fade out. It wasn't like that at all. They had to like vector it. It was like she actually won an award from the AAM for this project that she did, which was well deserved. But I wanted to illustrate this idea that, especially in the 18th century, the textiles were important for fashion. Silhouettes changed much more slowly than they do now. So it was really the textiles that, the fabrics that dictated whether you were in fashion or not. And the changing styles and textiles were really important. But here I also wanted to kind of globalize this idea and kind of create this illustration that fabric is important all over the world, even though almost every piece in this exhibition was Euro-American fashion, that there were these international influences. So there are a couple of sections in the exhibition that look specifically at the way fabric drapes, the way it's made. One of my kind of goals here is, a problem I sometimes have when I look at exhibitions. I get caught up in the labels because I want the information. But I really wanted those sections to force people to look at the garments and make comparisons. And then I looked at the history of the four major fibers. So I looked at silk, I looked at cotton, I looked at wool, I looked at synthetics. There's also sections on haute couture fabrics and kind of the feminizing of fabrics in the 19th century. But I wanted to create a story that was not just about kind of European fashions when it came to textiles, but where these fabrics came from and how it kind of created this more global story of silk. Because of course, so much of silk in the 18th century and into the 19th was sourced in Asia. An interesting piece that we have in our collection is hanging on the back wall on the right here. This is a piece of silk that was made in China for the export market. So it made specifically to go to Europe. And it's not embroidered, it's painted with flowers, which is very, very popular for a period in the 18th century, late 18th century. Madame Pompadour, for example, was very well known for loving these like delicate painted silks. But the reason they were painted is because it's much, much quicker to paint a piece of silk than to embroider it. It's quicker and cheaper. And so these were really practical things, but it really draws home the idea that in the 18th century, luxury came from Asia. That was the source of luxury. So almost anything that came from Asia was new, exciting, and very fashionable. And so you can see this brocaded gown that was with fabric that was most likely sourced in China. And then in the middle, we have this dress that's made of damask. And I really wanted to kind of unpack ideas about how we name things and how they come into our culture. So damask comes from Damascus because of the Silk Road, because of the role the Middle East played in kind of getting these goods to Europe. So I really wanted to think about how Asian culture kind of plays a huge part in European fashion that isn't always acknowledged. Cotton was another really excellent opportunity to talk a little bit more about international history. I was really lucky that we acquired this piece on the left right before my show opened, a few months before my show opened, and it's a silver muslin. So it's made of Bengali muslin, which is so like fine and transparent, but it's also embroidered with silver, like real silver wire. So I think this is a really great illustration of how prized and luxurious cotton was. Cotton is such an everyday fabric to us, but at one point in Europe, it was the height of luxury. But this also gives us a really great opportunity to think about the role India played in kind of popularizing cotton in the UK, and the lengths that Britain went to secure cotton, raw cotton in India. They colonized it invaded it, and created really restrictive rules that just decimated the cotton producing, the textile producing industry in India. They just wanted that raw cotton. And of course, that the source of that moves to the United States, and it's completely entangled in slavery. And so you can see these pieces from the 1840s, and then also this piece from the 1870s, because cotton production was still huge in the United States after the Civil War, and actually labor practices changed very, very little when we think about the change from enslaved production to sharecropping. And then the piece at the very end, I wanted to end on a slightly more positive note because the history of cotton can be very depressing. This striped blue piece is from a company called Redmon, which is founded by the Ethiopian model Laye Kabede. And it's all locally grown cotton, and it's all woven by women in, at first in Ethiopia. She's expanded, I believe, to Kenya and in some other countries on the continent. But how they're kind of taking cotton and using it to empower and employ people. So I want to talk a little bit more about some of the writing that I've done. So this is a chapter that Kelly mentioned, the cultural history of hair. So Sarah Heaton is a friend of mine that I met at a conference, and we stayed in touch, and she was editing the series, and she asked me to write about race, again, because she knew of my interest, of race and the intersection of fashion. What I didn't know very much about was the history of hair. So again, this, like fashion and dance, gave me a really great opportunity to dig a little bit further. But one of the things that I really was poignant for me, especially in this image that I included in my chapter, was ideas about class, and the multiplicity of kind of Black culture. That's something that we touched on a lot in Black fashion designers, that there's no kind of monolithic Black experience, but ideas about class and how that is just as important when we think about positioning a designer, a person in history, in an industry. We have to think about a lot of multiple sections of their identity. And then looking at literature is another kind of relatively new thing for me. This is the second article that Kelly mentioned. Dressing to Pass was an article I wrote for Fashion Theory. And this is the second article that I used to look at literary sources. I wrote a conference paper before that looked at 19th century Black novelists, Black female novelists, and how they used fashion. And this one looked at Black fashion written by Black women in the 1920s. And so literature was something I was really interested in as a source because, again, there's not a ton of sources that kind of look at, especially secondary sources, but primary sources as well, that tell us a lot about Black fashion. And so novels are a really great resource. Literature is a really great resource because it gives us a different perspective, but one that's a little bit more lively, a little bit more kind of embedded in the world around it. So it gives us much different information than, say, even a dress, a piece of material culture, or even something like Elizabeth Cackley's memoirs, which was much more straightforward. So it's really exciting to kind of think about literature. I've just started my PhD, and this is something that I'm going to delve in a little bit more in that as well. So when the pandemic struck, we all moved home. We're back at the office now, but March 2020, of course, we're all working remotely. And one of the things that the museum wanted to do was produce a little bit more digital content. So I'm co-curating this exhibition, Head to Toe, which will open in November, delayed from 2020. And so as part of that research, my co-curator and I, we put together 2 videos that are available on the museum's YouTube channel that look at the history of women's accessories. We'd already kind of done the research for this for Head to Toe, so our director asked us to put together an educational video. We typically give tours of costume history with material cultural objects on site, but we weren't able to do that while we were closed. And so again, it was this idea of kind of telling a straightforward fashion history, but injecting kind of new perspective, new voices, even just new images, I think can be really powerful. So here we talk about the parasol, and how parasols were so much wrapped up in ideas about class and race, this idea of like keeping women white and untanned, but also not only a sign of their whiteness, but also a sign of their leisure, but how they were appropriated by women of color. This woman on the left is also holding a handbag, and it's so interesting how handbags were really this kind of controversial accessory that women, it symbolized women's buying power, it symbolized women kind of existing outside the domestic sphere, and even today, there are huge connotations about, like, because they're so expensive, what does this handbag represent? So kind of scouring the internet for these images, we tried to find a lot of things that were public domain too, which helps us a lot. Was really challenging, but really rewarding because I found some really great images. Here is another example from my accessories video. I did 1900 or 1800 to 1900, and my co-curator Melissa Mara picked up and did the 20th century. But an important accessory of the early 19th century was shawls, and this is Josephine Bonaparte. She was very well known for wearing these cashmere shawls. But I also wanted to contextualize them because cashmere shawls were fashionable luxury items in India before Europeans kind of picked them up as a trend. But not only in India, they were a huge luxury item that was circulated all around Asia. They went to China, they went to Persia. These were highly prized around Asia, and northern India was really known. Kashmir was known for this product. So I wanted to kind of contextualize it at home as well. And so you just see this woman from the turn of the 20th century wearing this Kashmiri shawl. The popularity of shawls, of Kashmiri shawls in particular, really lasted a very, very long time. And here I talk about gloves and how gloves, like parasols, were very much a sign of kind of class and race, idea of keeping your hands kind of uniform, kind of unblemished, untanned. But when women of color kind of take on these fashion objects, they can change their meanings. Not only is it a way for them to kind of assimilate into Western culture, this is a woman living in California, but ways that they can use to declare, you know, their femininity, their participation in the fashion system, and ultimately their humanity. So my book just came out this past summer. It's an edited volume. It's called Black Designers, American Fashion. And the idea of it wasn't directly related to the Black Fashion Designers exhibition, but Ariel and I really thought about how few secondary sources there were available. And so that really inspired me, along with my advisor at NYU, Nancy Deal, who wrote a chapter in this book. Ariel also wrote a chapter. I had a lot of great scholars who contribute to this book. But we wanted to provide secondary information on Black designers. There's a lot of great things written about Black style and the role that clothing plays in Black lives at different parts of history, but not so much that focused on Black fashion designers. So I ended up writing 2 chapters in this book. The first was on 19th century Black dressmakers in New York City. And I was able to trace them kind of through the city using advertisements that they placed in newspapers. And so I could follow them with the kind of migration of Black communities through Manhattan, starting from the very lower tip up to going up to 42nd Street and above. This is the time before kind of Harlem was was kind of considered a Black neighborhood. And then my second chapter was about Scott Berry, who's a designer working in the 1970s in New York. You can see him here with Pat Cleveland, a really popular, really influential designer who's unfortunately kind of forgotten now, but who made a big impact in shaping kind of what American style looked like in the 1970s.